Started. Okay, welcome everybody. And we're going to have a really exciting webinar starting in about 60 seconds. We'll give folks a chance to roll in. I'm joined by my good buddy Atif here. So we're going to co-host this one for you. And super excited to share what we've been up to together over the last almost a year since we've formally met. Hey, Atif?
Yeah, definitely. Lots of fun conversations.
Yeah, fun conversations, and some really good. Where did we go for dinner or lunch when you were up in Calgary? Like it was a
I
really
did introduce you to goat curry, which you like
that's
a lot.
right, which I really liked. So if anybody needs a good recommendation for goat curry, Atif's your man. So welcome to today's webinar, another HelpSeeker production. It feels like we're putting these on quite a bit, but we're always so excited to be able to share with you guys what we're up to. And this one in particular is focusing on financial data and financial trends, but not just for the fun of it, because we're really looking at how this type of information can revolutionize social impact and social finance and the role of philanthropy within that. So that's why Atif is here. This is a project that we've done together, but that would actually not be true because it's really been his baby. And he affectionately calls it the crunch base for social impact. So we'll be able to share some of that with you as well. And there's a nice bonus at the end of this because there's some freebies, some free tools that Northpine has sponsored as a result of this work together that we're able to roll out through our free Cardo accounts as well. So stay tuned for that. There's a little kind of prize at the end of sticking with us, talking about money in the social impact space after we present. So starting off with the land acknowledgement, if folks haven't noticed, then you're not paying attention, that there's National Indigenous History Month in June. And yesterday was June 21st, National Indigenous Peoples Day. So I highly encourage folks to get familiar with Indigenous cultures. We actually put together a bit of a package here that we'll share with everyone. We did it last webinar as well, just some of the cultural resources and insights that we can make this learning fun and something you can do with your family as well. So some cool recommendations of artists and some cool recommendations of music as well. So we'll look for that in the package from today. But with that, by way of acknowledgement, I also wanted to encourage folks to say hello in the chat, and our comms team is online to make sure the chat is working if there's any problems with it. But by all means, please feel free to take a look at that and see if you want to tell us the treaty you're joining us from, the treaty territory you're joining us from, your name, just introduce yourself in there. And yeah, it looks like we've got a hi from Calgary and Tahir. So yeah, Tahir or Kagla, if you guys know the treaty territory or the Indigenous place name of where you're joining us from, we always like to start these webinars with a bit of getting to know everybody, and in the process we get to know a little bit more about the Indigenous stories and territories in the process, because we all get to have some of these insights that we would otherwise never really learn about different corners of this vast country, Turtle Island. So hello Emily, hello Kelsey. So Emily's from Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. We've got Rebecca from Winnipeg. We've got some Newfoundlanders. Challenge you to tell us the treaty territory and the place name. If you don't know, give it a Google right away and just drop it in there. You can't unsee it, is what we always say. So for today's agenda, we'll do a bit of, who's HelpSeeker, who's Northpine, and then Atif's actually going to take it away from a philanthropy perspective. Northpine's doing just amazing stuff, really disruptive in all the right ways when it comes to philanthropy. So I'd love for him to tell you more about how they're using the financial insight from the data and moving their approach forward. I'm going to talk to you guys about how to interpret some of this data and give you some examples of how some of this finance and social demand data can be used in real world cases. And I have a cool example. And in honor of National Indigenous Day, I'm actually going to use a First Nations example in my case study. But I think the application is quite visible to different organizations and challenges as well. We'll give you a bit of a showcase on the new financial flows feature in Cardo and tell you how to get your hands on it. So with that, yeah, I can see everybody's Tahir. Okay, back to you, Tahir. Delia's microgreens and territory, Mississaugas and Anishinaabe. So there you go. Thanks, Tahir. Lots of cool places people are joining us from all over Canada. And hopefully we'll get some time for Q&As as well. I think we're right on track. So, oh my gosh, don't we hate these pictures when they make us like stand in really pretty and look professional, but actually we don't ever look like that. Well, this is my shot of that. Actually, Ativ does look like this all the time, and he's always laughing. Half the time I think he's laughing at me, but that's okay. For myself, I'm the CEO co-founder at HelpSeeker Technologies, and I mean, Atif can tell you more about his background, but engineer, believe it or not, that ended up in social impact and social finance investing. So really cool background in the innovation startup ecosystem. I think you'll see that through his talk as well, and he'll tell you more about Northpine and his work. For us at HelpSeeker, it's all about data and social impact. So we develop software and data products that are meant to bring social impact leaders some of these new technologies to add value to their strategy, their tactics, their actions, their investments as well. So we see you guys as the front line of social impact and challenging us to think differently about complex social challenges, so addictions, mental health, homelessness, food security, all of those challenges that are still those wicked problems that require systems thinking and system solutions. For us, our contribution is to help you with the data component of that, the data equation, and that's what we're obsessed with. We'll again tell you more about that and give you some insight into how we do this work as well later in the webinar. But that's a little bit about us. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Atif, and advance your slide as you need me to.
Thanks, Elena. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace be upon you all. So happy to be here with you, Elena. This is coming from a lot of fun conversations we've had in the past, so it's very nice to be able to share it with everyone. I'll tell you a little bit about the Northpine Foundation. So the Northpine Foundation is what's termed as venture philanthropy, but basically what that means is we try to focus on ventures that have meaningful outcomes for the communities that we're meant to serve. How is it that we can improve those outcomes? How is it that we can think about the sustainability of those improvements and the scalability of those improvements, whether we're talking about breadth or depth? So Northpine, we operate across Canada, and the specific focus areas that we have as a private philanthropy foundation are really much on a big component human-based. So we're looking at formerly incarcerated people, refugees, people in Newfoundland, Labrador, and Scarborough. And we are also looking at climate and nature. For all these things, how we approach it is from a sector and solution agnostic perspective, being really focused on the catalytic sustainability and scalability of the meaningful outcomes for all these communities. And how we do it is we focus on what we call tailored financing, knowledge, networks, and flexibility. And the interesting thing that is relevant for this talk today is the tailored financing component. So if you go to the next slide, Elena, I'll talk a little bit about when we say tailored financing. I'll start with a bit of a story. And Northpine in itself is not a faith-based foundation, but I just happen to be a Muslim guy in Canada, and I like telling this story when I think about social impact. I think about, it's actually a prophetic story. of, in this case, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, walking through a community, and him and his companions see a bricklayer. And then the Prophet says, that person's going to heaven. And then all his companions ask, like, how is that person going to heaven? Like, and of course, they're really interested in learning how. And he spoke about the sincerity and excellence and authenticity of how and why he did his work. And when I kind of extrapolate that into this whole approach of decolonizing philanthropy and just thinking about the social good that we want to see in Canada, how is it that we think that anyone that we walk past in our community can be a part of that movement to help enable us to build out the social good across this country? Inside of that, from a tailored financing perspective, and now you can get the engineer that's going to nerd out with you a little bit, what that basically means is the traditional approach of saying, okay, there's one specific sector for social good, say charities or nonprofits, and there's one specific financial tool for social good, which is a grant or a donation. The question that we ask ourselves is, how is it that we can really catalyze different players in society to be part of this social impact ecosystem? And a big part of that was even diversifying how we thought about tailored financing. So tailored financing could mean social good could come from a grant, it could come from a donation, it could come from debt, it could come from an equity investment, it could come from all of the above, a blend of it all. At the end of the day, capital is just a tool. Capital is a tool, it's a fuel that fuels the models that we want to scale and sustain impact for these communities that we speak about. Then the next question is, okay, if we kind of just look at capital as fuel for impact, not the ends, but the means, how can we think about it differently? And how can we understand it a bit differently? So we think about money in the system. And I'm going to talk a lot about money today, because that's really, I think this is an important conversation to have. We talk about money in Canada's social safety net system, and the vast majority of it comes from the government at a municipal, provincial, federal, territorial level. And it can come from direct payments and benefits through social programs. We have almost 20% of our GDP is spent on social welfare programs, and almost $500 billion. If you go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about, let's talk about how the money flows when we think about social impact in Canada. And I will say, I'm going to just grab onto a definition of social impact, which is kind of looking at public services. So when we think about, there's about $15 billion in police spending, about $330 billion in healthcare spending. And if you look at all the revenue that the 86,000 charities across Canada have taken in a year, it's about $300 billion. And so we kind of look at the money going in to, and I say, like, when I look at the mandates of organizations being in the public service, and I kind of just use these as examples of police in the public service, healthcare in the public service, and charities in the public service, you have a lot of money going into these systems. And then on the other side, and I'll just kind of make this note about philanthropy, as you may know, philanthropy foundations, there's about 10,000 private and public foundations across Canada. The vast majority of them have what are called endowments, or what could also be called long-term investments. So these 10,000 public and private foundations have about $120 billion in long-term investments, where they're actually a very interesting mechanism if you think about what a philanthropy organization is in Canada. And this is coming from a tax perspective. Like I said, you're going to get the nerd in me. And Alina always brings out the nerd in me. If you kind of look at a philanthropy foundation, they're pretty interesting in the sense that they are, for lack of a better word, a public utility. And sometimes analogous to an investment firm, where they can, that $120 billion can be out there invested in the markets, getting a return on investment. However, they cannot extract that money for private gain. It actually has to stay in that public utility. and at least 5% of it each year has to be used for charitable objectives. So that's an interesting tool in Canada. Now, if you go to the next slide, when we talk about how much money goes into charities across Canada, we're looking at about almost $200 billion that is put into charities in Canada just from the government. So the biggest chunk of disbursements going to charities and looking at their revenue streams is coming from provincial governments. So you have about 180 billion, 60% of it coming from provincial governments. Municipal governments at a smaller level, around 11 billion, and federal governments at around 10 billion. So it's very interesting to see here the amount of money that different layers of government put into Canadian charities. And I would say this is only registered charities, and this does not include nonprofits. And the other point that I'll say is philanthropy of the, government puts in about 200 billion. Philanthropy, which includes foundations, as well as like other people that just donate as individuals, is about 20 billion. So as mentioned, the nonprofits, there's quite a lot of them. So there's this a bit of an unknown here that I just want to flag, that we don't know how much money goes into nonprofits. We actually have a very, very clear idea of how much money goes into charities and where they get their money from. And this was actually an interesting thing that kicked off the conversation that we at Northpine had with HelpSeeker. And if you go to the next slide, Lena, this was an interesting piece because there's a lot of open data when you think about the charity sector and philanthropy sector. If you go to the Open Canada Gov website, you can actually download reams of data that will tell you exactly how much money each charity took in from the donations. It will tell you exactly from what philanthropy foundations, how much money they're sending to different charities as well. It will tell you how much money charities are getting from different levels of government as well. It's actually quite astounding the amount of data that is out there about charities and philanthropy. And yes, Emily, we're talking about the T3010 data, and then there's also other forms that are part of T3010 that actually show how much organizations, like how much a philanthropy foundation donates to different charities. Inside of that data is a level of transparency that, and I would say I come from a mixed background. I've done government, charities, private sector, entrepreneurship, venture capital. When you kind of look at how private sector venture capital firms work, you have no idea where money is going. Maybe you hear about it when you read a news article one day that some investor invests in some company, but the level of data that's out there about how much money is floating in the charity sector in Canada, it's enormous. And this is such an interesting piece that kicked off this conversation with HelpSeeker. Was for us at Northpine, we saw this big challenge, and I'm sure everyone here that is focused on social impact might be able to relate to this challenge, which is, if you look at the private sector, and if you look at startup companies in the private sector, you may have heard of things called Series A, B, C funding, where basically means investors come in at various stages as you're growing out your business. But what it means is, if you're an organization trying to solve a problem, trying to build out the operations to solve a problem, you know that if you get your business model to point A and can get to point B, there's going to be a group of investors waiting for you at point B that can then help you take you to point C. So you kind of have this coordination of capital that helps these organizations scale as they build out their operations. And the big challenge that we saw is we don't really have anything like that when we talk about social impact. I mean, I'm sure anyone here works at a charity or nonprofit. You know that when you're out there, and even if you're doing good work, even if you are creating outcomes, you don't really have any certainty or any kind of pool of people that you know can be waiting for you from point A to point B that can help take you from point B to point C. What ends up happening is you end up applying for many different grants. You typically manage a lot of grants over a given year. But that level of coordination of capital in the ecosystem that lets impact scale by either breadth or depth isn't really there. So there are some really great organizations out there, like Grant Connect, Imagine Canada, and other people that are doing really good work with data. And I just want to give them credit for the work that they've done as well. But this is really the thing that started the conversation with HelpSeeker. And this is a little bit about what Alina is going to be talking about. So go for it, Alina.
Thanks. Thanks. Now you get to relax and watch and check out the chat too. If folks have questions and you want to engage with us while we present, by all means, we'll do our best to kind of cover each other off as well. And I saw a couple of questions in here, one from Emily as well. For my part, I wanted to get into exactly what we did and what we think the value will be to you guys as ecosystem partners in this work. So the biggest thing for me is to set the context here around the social safety net and what exactly we're trying to connect the dots on. So, you know, if you're impressed by my animation, it wasn't me, it was my team who did that. But essentially, it's really picking up on this concept that the social safety net is quite complex. I think it might be both complex, complicated, and at times feels chaotic. The biggest challenge with the fragmentation, though, is that the person that's trying to actually navigate it finds it extremely difficult to connect the dots for themselves at that user level, that client level, if you will. But for those of us that are trying to make an impact in the network, it's also really tough to understand where we play and what our value proposition might be. So yes, there's a lot of funding for sure, but the biggest question is how do you leverage all these efforts and line them up in the right direction to make an impact on common challenges, common social problems as well. So this is a bit of a representation of the social safety net concept, to just say that there's these various domains that are entwined, and no one organization truly only works on only one of these. I mean, I shouldn't say that exclusively, but oftentimes even somebody that might be a school, for instance, is actually doing mental health interventions and food interventions, even safety interventions with some of their clients. So it's really difficult to dissect their impact because they're really cross-functional and systemic in their intervention approach. So we do need to understand this data within that context, and also understand that charity and philanthropy is a small part of a much broader social safety net. So it becomes the question of where we play the best, or what the value proposition might be. So just a little bit more about the types of services, and as you think about this $1 trillion up here, know that at every stage that trillion gets, goes through various processes that are meant to add value, right? So compound value, so that by the time it gets to the client, there's actually, quite a bit more impact than just purely giving them the money directly is the concept. So if I put my money direct to the client, write them a check for their housing subsidy, no middle people, versus if I fund a fund of funds, and then that fund of funds funds another fund, and there's the theory is that we're adding value at every stage. So by the time something gets to the client, it's actually, the impact is that much greater because we're doing this scalable approach that Atif was mentioning as well. So a couple of areas where this plays out, and just giving you some examples of where the philanthropy funding plays into various publicly funded systems, right? So there's not much that is purely philanthropy. Philanthropy money is always kind of in addition to some other probably taxpayer sourced investment that tends to have the kind of bigger chunk of organizational budget. Now there's exceptions as per usual, and there's also public systems that tend to have much lower philanthropy component, and then there's some charitable organizations that almost solely rely on donations, et cetera, as well. So it's not exclusive, but talking averages and generalities right now. But the purpose of talking about this stuff is because we're wanting to understand how to use data to target our investments in a more strategic way. So I'm just going to speak about the value of data and becoming much more savvy in that micro targeting, if you will. So this is a screenshot from Cardo. It's one of our products where we look at indicators of risk. And so here we're looking at the Gini index, so income disparities, and we're looking at 5 to 9-year-old females. The project being, can we find areas where some of these populations have higher concentrations, and then come up with an investment strategy that might target these neighborhoods or these particular areas, versus spreading the money thinly when we're really only looking at something quite specific. So that's one way that this type of information can become much more insightful in your day-to-day practice as investors, is thinking differently about only having a part of the pie. So where does that part of the pie best intervene in terms of risk? And I think this is something I've seen, and I've got ideas from Northpine on building this, because they challenged us to look at service deserts and funding deserts, right? So imagining that these are actually areas where there is nothing, there's a high level of need, and there's a very low investment in those areas, and that's how they structured some of their investments as well, that you heard Atif mention before. So same idea here. Kind of, you can see the progression of this stuff where, you've got proximity to services. So back to that social safety net, understanding that, there's areas where we have high proximity to services, so lots and lots happening in that particular neighborhood, but there's some swaths of that community where there might be nothing as well. And being able to segment that and match your supply demand calibration and using your investment for that type of approach would be another concept here. Not to say you need to do this type of work. I'm saying this is the type of thinking that the data-led approach can support you in, so that you're adding that value that nobody else can, right? And the flexibility of philanthropy is so tremendous compared to government programs that have to do per capita, for instance. They just can do this type of micro strategy, and they also can tailor to say that, well, in this particular neighborhood, we know exactly what's available and what's not available. We know exactly what the risk is, and we know exactly where our focus area is and where it aligns with a community that we might want to invest in. So just to give you some concepts here about that. So I wanted, and I mentioned before, I was going to talk about the Northpine dashboard and how we use this, not how we use this, but how a community is using this in practice. And Battleford Tribal Chiefs is a community of 7 First Nations in Saskatchewan. North Battleford, if anybody's from there, please drop that in the chat so I don't say anything too out of turn. The context here is that it's a community that is under massive duress. So in North Battleford, it's actually the highest crime severity index in Canada from the latest CSI. And here's Canada CSI score, here's North Battleford. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them, again, entwined with our conversation about reconciliation and recognizing the harms of colonialism that continue to play part in the community as it does in many places across the country. What we've found in using this tool that I'm going to show you is that we are able to start to trace these disparities in the data. So to give you an example, and again, it's not because I'm saying that North Battleford is fully funded and they have all the funding that they need to have as a city. This is the municipality, but I'm saying the neighboring communities, the 7 nations, they have the exact same population, 14,000 in the city, 14,000 in the First Nations. They are bordering each other. The 30K per City of New Brunswick resident was the average in the city, and it was 15,000 for the Treaty members next door. So it's the question of parity is there. And so when the chiefs say, we know things they're not getting better, right? There's a perception that we're getting all this money, but that's actually not true, right? Here it is. Here's the data. The data doesn't lie. I mean, unless somebody's got a magical pot of money, by all means. But this is the publicly available data that we were able to draw. But here's the kicker. That 15K is only if inflation had been kept up to date between 2006 and 2023. So this disparity actually is eroded by inflation. So the disparity is even worse, right? And this is not just these nations, these Battleford tribal chiefs that are having this experience. This is across the country. So probably a lot worse in some communities than others. But imagine this type of inequity layering year after year after year after year, and the social infrastructure in this community continuing to degrade while the issues, the complexities are still there. And then, we're wondering why. I wonder why, or why is this a problem? Well, here's an answer, right? So this data can really help you understand that story and what's happening in these communities. So when a TEEPS team asked us to do this project, we had no idea this is going to be what we were going to uncover, but this is what happened. So I'll show you now what a couple more insights from this example as well. So same concept here. I wanted to show you this another measure of demand, low income, okay, the LIFO, and the low income among 0 to 5-year-olds. We don't need to talk, or do we need to talk about poverty in childhood and what that does over time? And of course, PalMaker 114, the indigenous, one of the reserves within the 7 nations that I mentioned before. And you can see these are bordering, right? These are next door to each other. So when people from PalMaker leave and they go into the city of North Battleford, and it creates these tensions that they're coming here and they're taking away our resources, remember that they don't have the infrastructure for that population to support that population either, and we're systematically continuing that disparity year after year. So this is the stuff that this data is able to uncover. The other thing it can uncover is how we can support these underserved and marginalized, systematically marginalized communities as well. So what we also did with the Northpine dashboard is created a tactical funding playbook for Battleford's chiefs to lobby for additional funding. So here's a 1-page, it's a 60-page document that gives them, here's how you position, here's where you can get funding, and here's some tactics on how to get some of this money into your community as well. So there's so much value out of this open data that we're able to not just uncover problems, but also find very practical solutions from. So I think we're almost ready to show you guys the financial flows feature. For those of you who are not familiar with Cardo, just so that people know where to get this, if you go to helpseeker.org, you can actually sign up for a free account and get access to this as part of the free account. So we'll give you a bit of a tour next, but as I pull that up, I just wonder if you wanted to comment on anything before I get into the tool itself and what your concept of the Crunchbase was with it.
Yeah, maybe I'll let you pull up the tool, and as you're doing it, I'll chat a little bit about it. But and the kind of analogy that I give to Crunchbase is, for people who are not familiar, Crunchbase is something kind of in the private sector startup world of how all these companies, as they're building out their products and businesses, it helps them find potential investors who might be aligned to a common mission or thematic area, as well as the funding size that they provide. Like, do they actually have the resources to support them at a particular stage? And in the same way, for the investors, it helps them identify, okay, who are all these organizations that could be mission or thematically aligned. So it's primarily like a relationship building tool. But I see there are the 2 questions that popped up here. Maren was asking if it allows us to target better investments. I think that could be one use. And to be honest, there's multiple types of uses for this, both from organizations seeking funders, from funders seeking out potential grantees. And I'll hand back to you, Alina, because I see you have it popped up now.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think we can totally do this together. Like I'll do a bit of a walkthrough of the features, and then I think people would love to hear from somebody that's in the investment space how they use it, because you see how we used it. But essentially the concept was exactly that. How can we take that giant data set, and there's actually several data sets, because you can see here that there's 2019, there's 2018, there's 2020. As more data comes in, we'll obviously update this as well. But how can we make this easy to navigate and give you the ability to kind of go between Alberta, BC, Manitoba, et cetera, how to look at each city. So you might be interested in this. This is Ontario, obviously. Lots of cities here, but alphabetically, so nice and clean. If you've ever tried to navigate the CRA website, it's just not meant to be a, something like this. It's great, but it's just giving this to you in an easier to use way. And then also the ability to look by organizational categories as well. This is how they self-report. So that's one caveat here. But also some interesting subcategories. This is the one I really love the most, but it's the most kind of detailed look, because I'm always interested in exactly what people are doing. So are you doing meals, or are you doing low cost housing? Right, so you can get much more detailed understanding here. Again, the caveat is that we have 2019 is the best data set, but we have some 2020 in here too, because obviously not everybody has all their data always cleaned up on and submitted to CRA, and in turn for CRA to release it out to us. So there's always a bit of a lag caveat there as well.
And maybe I'll also add, I
it.
see there was another question about the data from this platform is specifically coming from the CRA, but then there's other things on the HelpSeeker Cardo platform where they grab data from other sources as well. But something coming off of what Alina just said, anyone who knows data will know the famous line, garbage in, garbage out. So it basically means this entire platform is at the consequence of whatever people have, whatever all these organizations have entered into their tax forms. So what you might find from a data quality perspective is in many cases, the numbers are pretty strong, but the more qualitative pieces, such as categories, subcategories, like trying to find focus areas, those ones where you can find some inaccuracies. And this is just a consequence of how every organization in Canada fills in their forms.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. It definitely begs the question that we might need to have some common impact frameworks and some common definitions. And some of us nerds are working on that. University of Toronto is a great partner to that we've been working on a common social ontology of the social impact world. But until that type of stuff gets, brought into these data sets, it's gonna, we're gonna have to bear with it for a couple more years. But yes, this is like I said, free for you guys to have added, courtesy of Northpine. It was like a $10,000 donation or $15,000 donation, but a much deeper IP donation, I think, from Atif actually, because it's his brainchild to look at this in this way, and to see the potential of kind of bringing this type of understanding of the world to the social impact world from the private sector. The other stuff that Atif was really obsessed about and drove my team nuts, but here we are, we survived it, is to actually look at not just donors, but also donees of organizations as well. So not just looking at, what everybody's receiving and what's in long-term investment, what's in an asset, what's in liabilities, gifts, right? Revenues and revenue sources, how much money from government, how much money from whatever, but also where the money's going to between organizations, and looking at these funding flows across issue areas as well. So this one was how we built that tactical playbook, because essentially we said, okay, let's take a look at who else might be funding Indigenous organizations. And so we looked at categories and organizations that might support something that the Battle for First Nations is interested in. So in their case, we looked at the entire data set, and we actually picked out the healthcare, poverty, I think really for the aged, and some youth services. And then we found organizations that were receiving that type of funding, and then we looked at who was funding them. And so we were able to find, okay, well, they're receiving funding from, the Roman Catholic, I'm just picking that as an example, corporation, and those guys. And then when you look at those guys, you can then see, okay, they really like funding organizations relieving poverty. Oh, they really like funding Christianity or support for religion. So you can start to understand where your potential funding sources can come from. And so if I kind of go back to that funding playbook, you saw in the Indigenous specific work, the Indian Brotherhood Fund was one that came up, and they were quite a large entity, and the Battleford's chiefs didn't even know about it. So yeah, here they are actually, the Indian Brotherhood Trust Fund. So that is that is a significant potential investor that they could approach to move forward on, looking at some opportunities, and look, significant long-term investment. So they, like what Atif was saying, sitting on some opportunities there. Now, we always said, we told Battlefords that they shouldn't just go to Indigenous focused organizations, that there's actually quite some wealthy foundations that might, be interested in core health. And you can see here, the Lazarus Healthcare, they fund Sunnybrook Health Services Center. Well, maybe not as big of a deal, but again, there was that Saskatchewan based organizations that were pretty good fit. So that's how we've been using this in day-to-day practice, aside from telling the story on some of these challenges on parity as well. What else can we tell them? Did you want to give some examples of how you guys use finance?
Yeah, maybe I'll give a few
Sure.
other different use cases, because
Sure.
I see some chats
Yeah.
about like who would use this. So from a funder perspective, yeah, it can help you if you find that you're a funder that wants to fund in a specific geography. You can find other funders who are also funding in a specific geography or a specific thematic area. If you're an organization that's seeking funding, typically what you could do is say, you know what, I'm going to find other organizations that I think are similar to me, and I can actually find out who's funding them, because we might actually be mission aligned with those funders as well. And so it's a way of, if you're seeking funding, if you can think of other potential people, other organizations that are kind of like yours that do get funding, and you're actually wondering, you know what, I wonder if those funders are also mission aligned with me, this can help you find those as well. For people on the investment side, particularly looking at impact investors, if you look at the long-term investments column, that is telling you how much, for lack of a better word, how much these organizations have invested in endowments. Who knows, if you're an impact investment venture capital fund and you're seeking, say for example, you're an impact VC fund focused on food systems, and you say, okay, maybe there's foundations that do a lot of donations to charities on food systems, which means they're kind of aware of the sector and the mission. Maybe they might be interested in investing in our impact fund specific focused on food systems. And I know for investors, the one thing they care a lot about is getting mission aligned investors on board as well. So one of the whole things is like, how is it different people can find uses for this? And the other big piece is from the government side. And I know Alina and I have spoken about this. Lots of times, lots of governments don't even know the amount of charitable funding that is happening inside of their specific regions or jurisdictions. So this can kind of help you find organizations based off of that. So I see Stephanie had a question on how it differs from Grant Connect or iWave, for example. I'm not too familiar with, I haven't tried iWave before. I've seen Grant Connect. I think it could be, I mean, I haven't really used Grant Connect too much, but this one is kind of just, how do we just present the data that is provided to the CRA? I actually know Grant Connect does a bit more thorough deep dives into the organizations themselves. This tool is more of, how do you make all the information out there that is actually accessible? So when you kind of go on and get the reams of data that are available on opencanada.gov, this is kind of like a low fidelity model of what Grant Connect, for example, is doing.
Yeah, I think the basic thing is this is the free version. You don't have, this is open to anybody to get access to. Bloomberg's database. Yeah, Bloomberg is actually not too shabby. We've actually met with them, Atif, and maybe you can speak about what Bloomberg is what
yeah, no, very, like, I love what Bloomberg's database as well, which is also very much open. So this is kind of just a different way of navigating the data. That's really what it is. And I see, Martin, you had a question about can you distill the data between the 3 levels of government? So actually, yes, there's a column here that will say what specific level of government funds what specific organizations, as you see Alina popping up right here. So it won't tell you the exact government department or even the specific provincial government. So you kind of make the inference that you probably look at the location where the organization is based, which isn't always correct, but that's just an inference.
Great. Awesome. Any other questions?
And as you'll see, this is very much what we call an MVP. It is a scrappy minimum viable product. So we got a big thank you for HelpSeeker for putting it together, because there's all kinds of advancements you can do to this. But what we try to do is just break it down into the most simple thing, which was how do we just present the data that's out there?
Yeah. And then how do we make it easy to navigate? How do we keep building on this thing over time? And then it's also the thing is, as you can see, it's Tableau based. So Tableau is just a better visualization tool for enabling this type of complex analysis as well. Huge data set. How do we bring it to the masses with the least kind of not overbuilding it, right? So just to give you a sense of that, it was, like I said, it was a $10,000 project to get this out. So it's really scrappy, right? We want to see, do people actually like this, or is this valuable? Because there's fancy stuff we could do, but you also don't want to overbuild this as well. So as an example, I'll show you where this thing can go.
Alina, I don't know if you're going to be popping up the Tableau again, but there was a question that I think would be helpful, is kind of demonstrating again how you show all the donors for a specific charity.
Oh, yeah. You just click on that link, or you click on that organization, and below it pops up the relevant ones. It's the easiest one. But yeah, the big thing on where you can take this, here we're showing you guys the integration of AI and generating the insight off of publicly available data. So essentially the pipeline when a product is fully built, it doesn't look like this, right? This is like an MVP. It looks more like this. So you can imagine something more akin to like a baked product, where you can actually look at these various areas that you're interested in. This is showing housing, but this is all auto-generated, right, through AI, where you can actually, you don't need to analyze or summarize. It's already kind of showing that for you in easy to understand terms. And you can make this short, you can make this a paper on these types of trends. So you can kind of see that's the value, but there's no point in doing that unless you guys, as the people we're building this for, are going to be, interested in it. So today is also a bit of a plug to say, if folks are interested in this, in taking this further with us, there's, obviously getting it for free. But there's also other things that we've got in the works, and this is another Northpine. Sorry, my computer's slowing here a little bit. Another Northpine MVP that is even a little bit more not fine-tuned, but a little bit more provocative as well. So I don't know, Atif, if you wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of funding deserts and how you guys are looking at this concept over time too, where you can actually see areas that are completely unfunded by philanthropy and government as well. So maybe, if you want to.
Yeah, so this actually started out as, so I'll give you the Northpine perspective is, as you know, we pick very specific populations that we work with. And one of the first questions that we asked was, where are the populations? Where are they from a sense of population density? And then we asked, what's the amount of charity funding that is happening in those areas where these populations exist that we care about? Because that could help us get a sense of, are there particular areas that are underinvested? Because as we all know, and as anyone here knows, I wouldn't say just philanthropy. I say the flow of capital, full stop. Whether it's philanthropic, private sector, whatever it is, it flows at the pace of relationships. So what that means is there's going to be certain communities that even the populations that we care about, if they're in those communities and they don't have those relationships, that can yield, for, as Alina called it, a funding desert. So the reason that we asked HelpSeeker this question was to help identify where are the places that we should be building relationships with, that maybe we just don't know, that they're not knocking on our front door. So we found that really helpful by looking at the data to kind of give us a bit of a compass of places that we might be interested to start looking at.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. So why don't we do our pitch in the last 10 minutes for people to kind of come on the journey with us. Oh, but wait, but first, your takeaways. Oh, my bad.
Well, I think that's, you know what, maybe I'll quickly run through some of the questions here and then I'll give my takeaways. There was a question here on like the data quality piece, the reliability piece. Hands down, like I said, it's a consequence of the data in to the CRA, and that's kind of consequence of it. And I'll be completely honest, we actually made it out of scope to go deeper than that, because once you want to really dive into reliability of data, that's a PhD thesis on itself. And we decided to say, okay, this is the data that we have access to. For Anita, your question on, can you filter out national charitable organizations? No, so it'd just be whatever the organization is logged as their headquarters to the CRA, that's where they would pop up. So if you have like a national organization headquartered in Ontario, it will pop up under the Ontario tab. And this is a piece about the data validity. We see this a lot as a relationship building tool. Like data will only give you a bit of a compass, but it's up for all of us to kind of go one layer deeper beyond that. So the whole goal of this is, how is it that we can leverage data to be a compass on how to build relationships? And those relationships could come from many different people. It could be for organizations seeking funding for social impact. It could be for other funders that want to figure out who are organizations working in certain areas, or even other funders who want to meet with other funders on common areas. There's also, as to my previous point, thinking differently about capital. Capital is not just the donation dollars. Capital is also the investment dollars. How do you really catalyze that to connecting to impact? So we just wanted to basically build this purely as a relationship building tool. That's the extent of it. And by kind of opening up all this data that's out there, and the transparency in many ways does exist with the CRA, but the accessibility was the problem to solve here. So thank you so much, HelpSeeker, for helping us do that on making this data actually accessible in some kind of way, that those relationships could be built out. I see lots of questions on, is this recording going to be shared, and is the links going to be shared? So I'll let you go to the next slide.
Yeah, of course, you betcha, you betcha. Everything always gets shared, whether you like it or not. You're going to get spammed from our team. And also a plug as well, if you guys want to be part of this journey, as we and again, it's no cost to you, right? It's already free. Thank you to Northpine actually for doing this and bringing this idea to us, and for, yeah, and my team too, and the Northpine team for kind of sticking to it, because it's actually really hard to come up with some of these innovations and doing them in a really lean way like that really stretches both teams in all the good ways. And so we are always looking for people to test some of these new concepts, these new features. So if you want to be part of the next great feature out of Cardo with the HelpSeeker team, by all means. And I know Atif's team is going to be right alongside us as we continue this refinement. So yeah, we're looking for folks that are interested in exploring this stuff, taking it a step further. You don't have to ever talk to us again. You can just get the tool that we demoed today and kind of fill your boots on your own. But we love to work with folks that are passionate about data and technology as well. And if you've never done software testing, kind of a cool thing. It's kind of fun. So I encourage you to get in touch with us, and there's a link there as well, and to get your free account and get in touch with our team if you're interested about that. Q&A, I know we've got a couple more folks. We should also put a plug in for our next webinar as well. And this one's much more focused around social finance and impact investment. And we've got, we've got the big social finance fund at 755 million. I know we talked about $1 trillion today. So where's the 755 million going to add value to that trillion, right? So how do we actually kind of pinpoint some of that value proposition for this new model of investment in Canada that's really taking hold? So we've got the sector that has been plugged into that world much more so than us, but of course HelpSeeker has always something to say about everything. So those of you that are VCs, impact investors, foundation leaders, definitely keep an eye out for that one and join the next session as well. And with that, let's see how many Q&As we can take here. We've got love spatial mapping of reliable data, but it would be bold to say that data doesn't lie. Data themselves variability. Yeah, of course. Data layered on top of each other when you actually see not just one data set at a time. I think it's much better than just the CRA data. And hopefully people don't lie to the CRA. I hope that's true. We might have other problems, but yeah, you're absolutely right. We don't know if people are accurately reporting to the tax man. I hope we all are. We've been through 3 audits now because of our shred credits. So I agree. I highly encourage people to be very good on their returns, because that's going to make our data better as well as not get us in trouble. Other folks. Other ones, thanks for introducing this great tool. Yes, Sherry says I will email. Yes, please. Last question, given your strategic focus on refugees, will you be building refugee related data? And ooh, actually that's interesting. Hey, why don't you take that one, Atif, as like our and
it's interesting about when we talk about building in like a specific X population related data. This is so our tactic of how we use it. It's given that we don't have specific, like if we can't find a specific category in CRA, what we usually do is we kind of create our own synthetic category. And how we do that is we basically say, here's a bunch of refugee serving organizations, and then using the organization as the proxy to say, okay, who are the kinds of who's the funders of these organizations, et cetera, et cetera. So by opening up the data and hopefully making it a bit more accessible and usable, it allows us to play around with it, to use these kinds of proxy tools to ultimately find the answers that we want. I really, really wish CRA would use my exact language that I care about when I define impact. But a lot of it's how do we just navigate the information that we have. Alina, like you mentioned, there's lots of organizations out there across Canada trying to do common impact measurement frameworks at universities. I know the Common Approach, for example, is also doing work at a national level. So big appreciation for those organizations trying to do a common approach to impact measurement. It would be really valuable in order to allow us to have like a common approach to ultimately social good. But for now, we're kind of hacking away at it as we can.
No, that's perfect. And actually, Petra says there's a lot of IRCC open data available through IMDb. Absolutely, yeah. So you can, and I think I was showing you guys how we're layering in census data plus supply mapping data, that systems map. That data doesn't exist. We actually have to scrape it and then parse it and then visualize it. So sometimes you actually have to layer the stuff that's already there and clean it up and geographically map it. And sometimes you have to create it from scratch and then layer it and map it. But that's exactly it. We want to see, where do you guys want to take this? What's the big next value proposition? And it could be that next level of looking at these funding deserts, for instance, or really systemically marginalized sectors and communities where philanthropy can say, we're gonna really focus our capital on this equity challenge because we see it, right? And you know, I know that data does lie, but where we know systemic inequities happen, like the North Battlefords, and the data, you know, really kind of adds value to that argument. I hope I hope we can excuse some of the limitations in the data, and use it for that lobbying and advocacy work that everybody needs to do.
So maybe I'll just end off on, now everyone here is also a data nerd, if you weren't a data nerd before this call. And I love being around a bunch of data nerds passionate about the potential of society. So I just want to give a huge thank you for everyone attending today. And like Alina said, we'll be sharing out the links and recording. And this is going to be, it's open and free to use for people. So please play around and provide your feedback to HelpSeeker.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you next time. Have a wonderful day.